All right, this approach drill is called the steering drill. Steering is when an athlete runs down and they've got a certain point they've got to jump from, which is the takeoff. And so what they'll do is they'll modulate or adjust how far apart their feet make contact with the ground, or their stride length, and how fast they're making it, or their stride frequency. They'll change that in order to make sure that they jump from the same spot. You see younger athletes actually doing this really well. It's easier for a young athlete who's between ages of like 5 and 12 to rarely scratch. They rarely foul, and that's because they tend to adjust early on. They see the board way out, and they change how fast they're coming in to make sure that they jump from the same spot. Older athletes, what happens is they tend to be more consistent on their drive. They're pushing out. They may be more consistent on that gradual transition. But then if they don't do something right, what happens is the closer they get to the takeoff, they then tend to have those last 2 or 3 strides become the strides that they steer from. And that's not what we want. It is okay in some situations to steer early on. We never want to do it late on. So I'm going to use this cone right here to emulate. This is my takeoff board. This is where I jump from, okay? And now I'm going to use this to be about 4 steps out. This is what's called my coach's mark. So this is about 4 steps out, right? So that's right, left, if I'm a left-footed jumper, okay? So when I look at this, from the moment I take off on my approach, it's okay in some situations to do a little bit of adjustment early on. As long as I'm consistently at this takeoff spot, as long as my right foot lands consistently here and I consistently hit that, that's perfect, okay? So we can do drills where we can say, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and just say start from here. Even though my takeoff spot might usually be here, I might usually start back here. I'm gonna say go ahead and scoot up about a foot and make sure you land with your right foot spot on there. Because I don't want them to ever come down here. If they're spot on every time at that coach's mark, but then they are behind the board or over the board, that means they're doing adjustments down here. I'd rather them do any changes they need early on to make sure that when they get here, they're right foot and they're just left, pull, plant, and they're spot on every time at the takeoff board. So we can do a little bit of adjustment. Another thing I like to do is say, hey, just walk out to where you think your mark is and run down. All I want you to do is make sure that you're consistent on this board. If you need to do any adjustments on how hard you push out or how fast you're pushing out, you do that early on in the first couple steps. You never do it late on. All right? Because if they're going to do it anyways, you might as well have them do it a little bit earlier on than later. And there's different reasons on why you might actually think about, okay, if you have your mark and you're consistent every time, why would anybody ever want to steer? Well, right now you can see that there's a pretty strong headwind, right? So a couple things I can do as a coach, I can say, well, you got this really strong headwind, so we can adjust your starting point. We can either move you forward, we can move you back if you have a headwind or a tailwind, or we can say, okay, you're going to push out for a little bit longer. Instead of a 6-step drive, you're actually going to drive for 7 steps before you start to transition upright, right? So there's a couple different things we can do, and knowing that you can just make those adjustments on the fly. Hey, I'm comfortable. I know I've done this in practice where I've drived out and I've made any changes I need to make, but every time I get upright, I know that I'm 4 steps out. I'm just boom, 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 boom. And I know I consistently do this every time. So this is steering drill. It's a great way to emphasize if you need to make adjustments, do it early on, not later on. All right.